Thank you for joining us this evening. You are now attending the webinar entitled The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone, and How We Can Prosper Together. Our leader for this session is, again, New York Times bestselling author, advocate, and speaker, Heather McGhee. Heather McGhee designs and promotes solutions to inequality in America. Her first book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together, spent 10 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and was long listed for the National Book Award and Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction, among numerous other awards. In the summer of 2022, The Sum of Us was adapted into a Spotify podcast by Higher Ground, the production company of Barack and Michelle Obama. The Sum of Us was adapted into a young adult reader's version by Random House Children's in February 2023. Heather has testified in Congress, drafted legislation, and developed strategies for organizations and campaigns that warrant changes to improve the lives of millions. For nearly 2 decades, she helped build the nonpartisan Think and Do Tank Demos. Serving 4 years as president, an influential voice in the media and a former NBC contributor, McGhee regularly appears on NBC's Meet the Press and MSNBC's Morning Joe, Deadline White House, and All In. Her 2020 TED Talk entitled Racism Has a Cost for Everyone reached 1 million views in just 2 months online. She has shared her opinions, writing, and research in numerous outlets, including the Washington Post, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Politico, and National Public Radio. McGhee's conversation on a C-SPAN program in 2016 with a white man who asked for help to overcome his racial prejudice went viral, receiving more than 10 million views and sparking wide media coverage that included a New York Times op-ed, a New Yorker piece, and a CNN town hall. In spring 2018, Starbucks founder Howard Schultz asked McGhee to advise the company as it designed anti-bias training for 250,000 employees in the wake of the unjust arrest of 2 black men in Philadelphia. McGhee wrote a report with recommendations for how Starbucks can apply a racial equity lens to their businesses and how other companies, both large and small, can benefit from doing the same. Heather is the chair of the Board of Color of Change, the country's largest online racial justice organization, and volunteers for numerous other boards in the fields of philanthropy and social justice. Heather graduated from Yale University and the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and has honorary degrees from Muhlenberg College, Niagara University, CUNY, School of Public Health. She lives in Brooklyn with her urbanist husband and a chatty preschooler. I'm going to go ahead and plug the sites as well. So if you would like more information, please visit heathermcghee.com and follow her on Twitter at HMcGhee and Instagram and Facebook at Heather C. McGhee. To our network of teachers, both nationally and internationally, and without further ado, I present to you our scholar and our leader for this session, Heather McGhee. Heather, we're honored to have you, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. It's really a pleasure. It was great to hear about all of the incredible programming going on at the center, and it's wonderful to be with hundreds of educators across the country here this evening. Thank you. You have all had long days as I just sat completing my kindergartner's homework with him at almost 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night. I thought about all of you finishing your days, having taught people, hopefully a little bit older than my son, but having gone through wrangling all of those young people and those young learners, and then taking the time out of your evening to sit and to learn and to engage in these important ideas. It's really quite impressive, and I'm just honored to be a part of it. So I want you all to bear with me a little bit because I am used to speaking, where I can see faces and all of that. And so this webinar format is kind of new to me. And we, did some slides just for this event. So I feel a little bit like I'm at the beginning of the pandemic when I was teaching at CUNY and I did my first, courses online. I feel a little bit like that right now, but hopefully you'll bear with me. I'm going to talk for a little bit for probably about 35, 40 minutes, and then really look forward to questions. and we'll just take it from there. And I think Mike explained how to add your questions to the Q&A, and we'll get it started. And if, of course, at any moment people can't hear me or there's something wrong with the slides, do not be shy. I'm sure you won't. We'll make it through this together. As Mike said, I really am a public policy wonk, right? I spent nearly 20 years working in public policy research and advocacy because I cared about the growing inequality that had really been the defining feature of the United States throughout my entire lifetime. And I wanted to be a part of helping find solutions for the kinds of communities and people that I grew up in on the south side of Chicago, where it felt like there was no limit to the amount of work that people were doing, no limit to the amount of hustle and hard choices that people were making, and yet they still couldn't get ahead, much less stay afloat. While at the other end of the spectrum, you saw so much wealth being accumulated. And I grew up in that time in the 1980s and 90s and really saw the economic dislocation that was going on when factories were closing and public sector cuts were happening. And it really impacted me. And I began to be the kind of kid who would ask, why? Why is this happening? And I was very fortunate to have a family and an education and teachers in my life who didn't say, well, it was because the people who got evicted did something wrong, right? They would say, well, there's not enough housing and there's not enough affordable housing. We stopped investing in affordable housing. And they really taught me to look upstream to policy solutions. And I was able to get a career in public policy for the greater part of 2 decades. And then I made the really unexpected decision to quit what in many ways was my dream job in 2017. I had started out as an entry-level staffer at the nonpartisan nonprofit public policy research and advocacy organization, DEMOS, and I had worked my way up the corporate nonprofit ladder to become president of the organization. I served as 4 years, and I ended up handing over the reins in many ways out of frustration, not with my colleagues or the job or the institution, but about the very idea, the sort of premise of a think tank, which is that if you just spot problems in the economy and do white papers and statistical analysis and research to show what's going on, and you craft evidence-based solutions to those problems, and you bring them to decision makers in Washington and in the halls of Congress and in business, that they would make better economic decisions that were in our broad economic self-interest. That was sort of the theory. And yet I was experiencing time and time again, no matter how much data we put in front of decision makers to show them that we should raise the minimum wage from $7.25 an hour, which it's still stuck at the federal level and in so many states across the country, or that we should have more programs to help people really survive and thrive. There was just this resistance. And so I handed over the reins and really set out on a journey that would become The Sum of Us. And The Sum of Us is a book that was published in 2021. And then, as Mike said, I was really honored to be invited by Random House Children's to adapt it for young readers, specifically for middle school and high school students. This slide here shows the cover of the book for the young readers version, which is out in hardback now. It'll be out in paperback in January of 2024. There is an educator's guide that I worked very closely with a wonderful scholar on to be able to give educators of those middle and high school students exactly what they needed to be able to use the book in the classroom setting. And you'll notice a sort of a trend here. I really did write The Sum of Us with the goal of using it for people to learn together. Every single thing that I've done with The Sum of Us, I have created an educator's guide, a discussion guide, because in the back of the paperback. The discussion guide is there. All of the discussion guides are on my website. As the resource page that was sent out shows, there's a discussion guide for university level, an educator's guide for university level. There's a discussion guide for book clubs and colleagues to do in workplaces and church groups that we've seen happening all across the country. And then, of course, this Young Reader's Guide has a classroom educator's guide. Um, I was also invited to do something that I really, really loved. It was a big kind of leap for me. I feel like there are kind of two people in the world these days. One, there are people who are podcast people and people who are not. And, the podcast people, you wake up, you put a podcast on, you make your coffee, you go for a jog, you've got your podcast on, you're commuting to work, have a podcast in on. And then there are people like me who are just like, isn't that radio? I don't understand. But anyway, somehow I ended up becoming something of a podcast person because I had the wonderful opportunity a year and a half after the book came out to go back on the road because, as I'll explain, The Sum of Us is really a journey. It's a story of a journey that I took across the country from California to Mississippi to Maine and back again multiple times. And a year and a half after The Sum of Us was published, I was able to go back out on the road in search of more stories of hope and solidarity, and to use the really beautiful medium of the audio documentary, of the podcast, with a team of incredible producers at a company called Futuro Studios, who really were on the ground with me, finding real people in mostly overlooked corners of this country who had come together across lines of race to solve a big problem and had won. And this limited series, this podcast, has also been a real teaching tool. I've heard from educators across the country, as well as clergy and employers, that, of course, there are many different learning styles. And for some people, the kind of gripping audio documentary format, which has a little bit of history in it, has the sort of zoom out of the context of various issues in our country, from indigenous boarding schools and land rights to issues like environmental justice, to issues like reproductive justice. These have been really wonderful teaching tools, and each episode kind of stands on its own, but is also, the series goes through the 9 episodes. And after we finished wrapping and cutting the podcast, we wanted to create a standalone website and a standalone guide. It includes an episode by episode guide where you look at each of the kind of characters, the main characters, these real people in each of the episodes, hear about their activist journey. The whole premise of the podcast is that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And so it's an interactive website that lets students and learners and anyone who's engaging with the podcast really think about, well, what kind of activist would I be? There's a discussion guide for each episode that is really like an educator's guide. It allows for thinking about some of the issues, the actual public policy, social, humanities issues that are at the heart of each episode in one's own community. So you can find that at thesumofuspodcast.com. And as well, there is a First Year in Common reading guide. A lot of cities have made The Sum of Us a one city book, and it's been a first year book for a lot of incoming first year college students. So I wanted to put those resources right up at the front because to sort of show my hand that I really do. I wrote this book with the deep aspiration that people would read it together, that they would learn together, that this issue of racism in the United States, which can become so divisive, that The Sum of Us really is an offering to have people of all races, backgrounds, and stripes come together and learn about our shared history and how the distortions of our shared racist history have really had an impact on all of us. It is really, the goal is for people to learn together in a way that hopefully helps cross some divides and build bridges. So now, with that, I want to take you on the journey with me. So really, my journey began, as I said, out of frustration when I realized that I didn't have a good answer for a question that many of you may have asked yourselves at some point in your lives, which is simply, why does it seem like we can't have nice things, right? And by nice things, I don't mean, flying cars or those hovercraft backpacks that we were supposed to have, that Back to the Future said we'd have back now by now. No, I mean, universal child care, a well-funded public school in every neighborhood, excellent teacher pay for the people who have the hardest and most important job in our society, good jobs for everyone who wants one, middle class, life sustaining jobs, paid family leave, right? These are the kinds of things that most Americans desperately need, that are the foundations of strong families and strong societies, and yet they continue to be really out of reach. And when I say we can't have nice things, I mean both the Americans of color who are disproportionately impoverished and uninsured, and the white Americans who are the largest share of the impoverished and the uninsured. Now, as I said, this really is. I dedicated my career to fighting inequality, right? And the indicia of inequality are just so strong and so vast. I'm just going to give you a quick reference to two of them, right? The ways in which the rich have become so much richer over time. Right. On the left, we have the growth of the bottom 40% of wealth between 1983 and 2016 versus what has happened to the wealth gains in that period of the top 1% and the wealthiest tenth of a percent, right? We've really seen just this amazing disparity in fortunes that is not just about very wealthy people having a lot more awesome inside them, but rather is really about the concentration of wealth and power, and the way in which, for example, we have so many Americans who, nearly half at the beginning of the pandemic, were paid too little to meet their basic needs for things like housing and food, while the richest 5% of Americans own two-thirds of the total wealth, right? And so as I worked to get policymakers and business leaders uh, on board with the idea of addressing inequality, I ran up against these invisible headwinds in my career, and it wasn't just me. Obviously, it was all of us who were working for a fair economy. And I began, as I said, to feel very frustrated. And I decided to leave my job and hit the road in search of a more compelling answer to why it is that we can't have nice things. When you have this massive amount of irrefutable data around inequality, why is there not a national will to really address it? And what I learned is that our collective economic progress is being held back by a lie. And that lie is the lie of the zero sum. Now, zero sum thinking is thinking, it's a story, right? It's a narrative that says that there's sort of a fixed pie of well being. And if one group gets a bigger slice, the other group gets a smaller slice, right? A zero sum game, of course, is one in which there can be no mutual progress. If I score a point, you lose a point. And it's this zero sum thinking about the world and different groups and their role in it, which has really become a predominant way of seeing the world. And I was trained in law and economics, and you all, as humanities folks, will really appreciate how much I had to sort of put economics to the side to really understand why we can't have nice things, and really delve deeply into the social sciences. And it was really with the social sciences and long conversations with sociologists and political scientists that I really began to understand how much what we believe as individuals and as groups in society helps to shape economic outcomes because it shapes our politics and what we think is right and fair, who we think deserves, who we think belongs. And one of the main predominant narratives in our society is that of the zero sum lie. And these two scholars, Michael Norton and Samuel Somers, revealed that, in fact, not only is there this predominant zero sum worldview, but the worldview is a racialized one. It's racialized in the sense that when people who think of the world as a zero sum game, think of this fixed pie of well being, it is in fact racial and ethnic groups that are seen as competing with one another. And that it is racialized as well in the sense that white Americans are far more likely to view themselves, view the world through this zero sum prism. Put plainly, white folks tend to think, the plurality of white Americans uh, see that progress for people of color is going to come at their expense. And uh, a very small minority of Americans of color see the world this way. Typically, we don't tend to think that our progress has to come at white folks' expense, but the reverse isn't true. And so, this zero sum lie and its predominance was really a big aha moment for me, because it went so counter to the way that economists look at sort of like what their kind of mental model is, right? Um, our mental model in economics is that inequality is holding us back, right? That it's bad for growth. It's not a zero sum game, it's more like a regular sports game where you want all your players on the field scoring points. You don't want anyone sidelined due to debt or discrimination or disadvantage, right? This study from the economists at Citigroup, the large financial institution, had a conservative estimate that the black white economic divide had cost the US GDP $16 trillion dollars over the last 20 years, right? And so that's from this, that's the sideline theory, right? That's that mental model of the way our society works. It says if you have players on your team that are sidelined and can't live up to their potential, can't start new businesses, don't have the kind of economic freedom to contribute to their potential, you're not going to have as strong of an economy. But then the zero sum lie tells us that we are not all on the same team, right? It's that us versus them thinking that is a massive story in our society. And it runs counter to what should be in our economic collective self interest. Now, when I learned from Professor Somers and Norton and others, um, related areas of inquiry are group status threat and last place aversion, right? All of these sociological terms that just basically mean that many of us in the US, feel like we're competing with one another for scarce resources. But when I learned how racialized that was, that white Americans were far more likely to view the world through a zero sum prism than were Americans of color, I had to give myself a little pause, right? And I did this. I learned to do this a lot throughout my journey, which was a physical one, as I said, across the country, and also an intellectual one. And when I would come across something, um, that troubled me or that I wanted to kind of pause on, I wanted to not take it for granted. I wanted to sort of get underneath it and again ask why, right? So instead of just saying, oh, okay, well, white people are more likely to view the world in this zero sum competition way and just sort of taking that for granted or sort of naturalizing it or essentializing it, I wanted to say, well, why, right? There's nothing biological about this, right? There's no relationship between the melanin content in your skin and your proclivity to see the world in a zero sum way, right? This is not natural or biological. Everything we believe comes from a story we've been told. Right? And so, if everything we believe comes from a story we've been told, I thought, well, let me ask, well, who's telling my white brothers and sisters this story of this zero sum competition that if for black people to get by and get ahead, that means that white people have to be worse off, for example. Who's telling this story? Who's selling them this story? How are the people selling this story profiting from this story? And then what is it costing white people to buy this lie, this story of zero sum thinking? And to really get at it, I had to take a little journey to history, right? Because and there is so much history in the book, The Sum of Us, because um, not because I'm an historian by any means, because I just realized that in order to understand where we are standing now, we have to understand the steps that we took to get here. And so as I thought about, well, where did this zero sum story come from? I started to look at the founding economic model of the United States, right, which was one of the most profitable, if morally bankrupt ones that a society had ever created. Right, it was a model, an economic model of stolen land, stolen people, and stolen labor. And in the early days of what would become the United States, there was a lot of unrest, there was a lot of dissatisfaction and foment, revolt and rebellion. This was before the American Revolution, because this this economic model, where you had colonial plantation elites who owned all the land and resources, and then you had Africans who were enslaved, Europeans who were indentured, indigenous people who were often enslaved and exploited. You had it was a tinderbox, right? You had so many more people who were suffering and leading short, brutal lives with no chance of hope or freedom. And then you had a colonial plantation elite. And so at the end of the 17th century, there were a series of cross-racial servant uprisings, right? These small rebellions and revolts, and the biggest one of which is depicted here in this uh, painting, which was Bacon's Rebellion. And this is a big part of, if there are any Virginia educators on the line, this is often taught in Virginia history and maybe labor history and not many other places, but some people call it, our sort of first revolution. And in Bacon's Rebellion, it was a cross-racial, black and white uprising of people who were landless and in various levels of unfreedom, and it was almost successful. It burned the capital of colonial Virginia to the ground, chased the colonial governor out of um, out of the capital into hiding, and it only they only surrendered the rebels when their leader died of disease, and the people who surrendered were a group of African and European servant fighters. Now, why does Bacon's Rebellion matter? Because it was a time of cross-racial solidarity that was seen as a massive threat by the ruling elite at that time. And in response, over the next decade after the defeat of Bacon's Rebellion, colonial Virginia legislators, the vast majority of whom were plantation owners, created what we would then later know as the kind of racial caste system. They created a series of laws that were absolutely creating a sort of legal zero sum. They were actually taking affording a number of skin-based privileges for the first time, really codifying the idea that Africans would be forever enslaved and that European Christians could work their way out of indenture, that Europeans should own arms and be able to freely gather, whereas Africans should not. They pardoned all the Europeans who were part of the rebellion and did not pardon the quote unquote Negroes, right? So this idea of breaking the bonds of solidarity, offering these skin based privileges to the Europeans, saying you can be this other thing, white, then it doesn't matter if you don't have enough land or money because you can side with your color instead of your class. And it really has been that story that has offered up a sort of zero sum um, kind of worldview, which said there's a racial hierarchy and you want to jealously guard your position near the top of this racial hierarchy. You don't want to ally yourself with anyone any rungs below yourself on this racial hierarchy. This has been a story that has been sold over generations and generations in U.S. history, and it has only ever truly benefited the very wealthy and powerful. And so this story, this sort of kind of really old history of lost solidarity, is one that I think really is helpful to know as we understand how we got here, where this template of the zero sum story came from, who's selling it, how they're profiting from it, and in whose interest it serves ultimately. So beyond the zero sum kind of real lesson that I learned in the course of my journey was the second big lesson, which was the story of what happened to many of the country's nearly 2,000 lavishly funded grand resort style public swimming pools. Now, stay with me here. Um, we have got a society that in the 20th century saw a building boom of roads and bridges, public roads, bridges, libraries, schools, and these pools. These pools were the kinds that could often hold thousands of swimmers at a time. I first encountered this phenomenon of the grand New Deal era public goods pool, of the kind that there were nearly 2,000 built in the 1930s and 40s during this era of public goods. When I was on the road with my young son, who was a real toddler back then, and for those of you who've ever traveled, certainly road tripped with young children, you know, you're kind of making your itinerary based on map designations of where there are parks and playgrounds, so you can get their zoomies out and have them run and run and run and run until you strap them back in the car seat, and hopefully they'll take a nap. And so we were in Montgomery, Alabama, for the research for the book. I was with my husband and my young son, and we found this beautiful park in the center of Montgomery called Oak Park. And we went to visit it, and there was not this pool. In fact, where this sort of vintage postcard is, please excuse the citations as source Pinterest. That's not quite right, but we'll go with it for now. We have right where you see those beautiful old oak trees in this vintage postcard. There was actually just a wide, flat, grassy expanse, right? And we had just an incredible number of um, uh, pools in this country that were lost over the 20th century. And as I began to dig deeper into the history of how we lost these pools, it began to really reveal a lot about why we can't have nice things, right? Because in the 1930s and 40s, we had this building boom, as I said, of public goods, but we also had these economic public goods, right? Economic public goods like the Social Security Act in the New Deal era, right, which ensured that no one would have to work until they died in poverty, which created a retirement security and dignity. We had economic public goods like a massive investment in housing that workers could afford, right? And then on top of that, really something heretofore unprecedented, which was the idea of mass home ownership. This was a government policy in the New Deal era that took a big bet and said, well, working people should be able to use a government-backed, regulated, and insured financial instrument and get into a government-subsidized private development and be able to have that American dream. We also had the economic public good of the GI Bill at this time, right, which put a generation of returning veterans into no down payment home ownership, right? Fancy that, and into free college, right? And altogether, these kinds of economic public goods, not to mention the labor laws at the time, they all created the American dream, right? The greatest middle class the world had ever seen, right? The highest standard of living in the world in the United States in the 1950s. And this was not an accident. This was the result of deliberate public policy decisions, and it was the reflection of an ethos of public goods, right? This idea that was really born out of the excesses of the first Gilded Age of inequality, which we've now surpassed, by the way, um, and born out of the lessons of the crucible of the Great Depression. It was an ethos that said, well, government actually has a right and a responsibility to ensure a decent standard of living for her people, right? And should invest in these public goods, both the literal goods and infrastructure, and these public policies to make for the strong middle class. And yet, virtually everything I just described was, in one way or another, racially restricted and exclusionary, right? So, now this is history that I think has become more well known in recent years. I'll be the first to say that even I, as a Black woman, as someone for whom, my parents and my grandparents lived this history, shaped our economic lives, as a person with, a law degree and a degree from a expensive school, I still did not know, even in my career in public policy, the degree to which all of the economic policies that helped to create the great American middle class had an asterisk of racial exclusion, right? And so this photograph here is a photo of one of the many federally subsidized, housing developments, right? Where does our housing stock come from in the United States? So much of it was built in this period in the 20th century when it was government policy, because of a never substantiated assumption that Black people would be too much of a credit risk, right? So we've got the progressive federal government under FDR, the New Deal, right? They weren't saying we hate Negroes. They were saying, well, they'll just be a bad credit risk. And so they didn't substantiate that assumption, but they made it public policy. So not just in the Jim Crow South, but across the country. This one is from California, right? As a condition of subsidy to private developers, the government required that they include these racial covenants, making the developments, the properties. For example, the language would read things like, this property can only be sold or leased to someone, quote, wholly of the Caucasian race. Right? We know about the redlining maps, right? The way in which across the country, the progressive FDR government in the New Deal commissioned maps of the entire country and surveyed them down to the block level for their racial and ethnic character, and then created a grading system where the red areas were graded the hazardous for lending, and then banks would not be allowed to lend in those areas. I deliberately included places like California just to remind us this is not a sort of Jim Crow Southern story exclusively, right? This was federal policy. The Social Security Act, right, which ensured that no one would have to work until they died, excluded the two job categories that most Black workers were in. Right, excluded the categories of domestic work and agricultural work. The GI Bill was race neutral on its face, right? But the benefits were in housing and education, right? Two very segregated sectors at the time, right? So you had the result being this sort of public goods era that created an American dream, but only for some, right? And we had this amazing gulf created by public policy where generations of Black and brown people were locked out of the kinds of free stuff and the kinds of policies that made it easier for immigrants from Europe, native-born whites, to really find the American dream. And so too were the public swimming pools, often segregated, either with a whites only sign at the fence, right? We have this 1952 image, right, of a fence and the real designation, demarcation, you may not come in, or just it was custom. And so it was enforced socially through intimidation and violence at the water's edge, right? But when in the 1950s you began to have more and more black families and their allies take to the United States court system and argue that all of these public goods had been funded by black tax dollars as well, right? And so, in the case of the swimming pools, black families should be able to swim as well. Courts began to side with the civil rights movement and issue desegregation orders for public swimming pools. And these public swimming pools were a real site of, communities they were a real site of community investment. Many of them were these grand resort-style pools that could hold thousands of swimmers. And as they began to be threatened with the very idea of, black children, wading in the shallow end, it became a crisis across the country. And many towns and cities, instead of complying with the integration orders, decided to drain their public swimming pools. Right? So they literally drained out the water. In many cases, backed up truckloads of dirt and gravel, seeded it over with grass. That's why Montgomery, Alabama, my son was able to run from tree to tree across a huge flat expanse, because 10 feet under the ground of his feet was buried the carcass of what used to be one of the largest swimming pools, public swimming pools in the South. Right? And so we had this phenomenon, and it wasn't just in Montgomery, Alabama. It was in Washington State, in New Jersey, in West Virginia, in California, right? Public swimming became the site of contest, became the site of white violence and riots. You had whole towns coming up with ridiculous schemes to try to make their public swimming pools private in order to avoid integration. You had towns sell or lease their public pools, right, which had been paid for by tax dollars, or used to be free to the white public. They would sell or lease them to a private membership club that then could create a whites-only membership roster, right? Oftentimes it was the YMCA that would be the private membership club that would be a partner for these schemes, right? So listen, I am not an expert. First of all, I'm not an historian. I'm not an historian of recreation, right? That is not what I am interested in. But I began to be obsessed with the story of what happened to so many of the country's 2,000 beautiful New Deal era public swimming pools and the very promise of public swimming in the wake of public pool integration. One of the oddest moments in my kind of book tour that I had after the book came out was when I got a a media request from a publication. I think it was called Backyard Swim and Spa. Now, this was the trade magazine for people who sell and install and service backyard swimming pools. And they were doing a cover story that was sort of a racial reckoning with the history of their industry. Because when did the private backyard swimming pool become kind of de rigueur for the middle class family? It was in the wake of public pool integration. It was this idea that if there was high level of public support for doing things in the public, for spending public money on the nice things in life, but that was conditional on the public being seen as good by the white majority. And these are people who had been taught by the government for generations, right? For generations, that there was something wrong with black people. And so once the government went from being the enforcer of the racial hierarchy, right? The government was the one printing the whites only signs, commissioning the maps, requiring the racial covenants, right? And then for the civil rights era to see this shift from the government enforcing racial hierarchy to the government upending at times the racial hierarchy with civil rights and equal justice, that was seen by many white Americans as a betrayal by the government. And so we saw support for the very idea of government, for the very idea of public goods, begin to falter. And that's where I really began to have this light bulb that what we're seeing is drained pool politics. It is the phenomenon of people who have been taught to disdain and distrust other people based on their group identity. People who have been taught that it's a zero sum game, that progress and nice things for another group is going to be a threat to their well being. They would rather drain the pool and have no one have a nice thing than share that nice thing. Right? And I began to see this phenomenon of drained pool politics in so many different places. Here's one snapshot. In 1956 and 1960, according to this large, wonderful longitudinal survey called the ANES, two-thirds of white Americans polled believed that government ought to guarantee a job for anyone who wanted one who couldn't find one in the private sector, right? A federal job guarantee, right? And two-thirds of white Americans also thought that government ought to guarantee a minimum level of income below which no family should fall, like a universal basic income. My friends, these are radical ideas in today's politics, but they were popular with nearly 70% of the white majority in 1956 and 1960. By 1964, right, 4 years later, the share of white folks supporting these two robust economic public goods, these economic guarantees by the government, fell nearly in half to just about 35%, and it's stayed low ever since. Now, as a researcher, when I see that kind of a statistical swing in such a short period of time, right, we have 56 and 60, but then by 64, it's plummeted. Well, then you've got to look beyond the spreadsheet, right? You've got to ask, well, what's going on in our history at this period to make such a massive shift in public opinion, right? Between 1960 and 1964, what is going on? And of course, it's the civil rights heyday, right? 1963 is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. We just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech, and the black protesters and their allies in organized labor who came to the mall that day, they had a set of demands, and those demands included a federal job guarantee and a national living wage, right? There was the real understanding that the next front of economic demands was going to include everyone who had contributed to this nation's prosperity, no matter their color, not just white people. And that really began to change the sort of understanding of what government benefits should be and could be. 1963 was also the year that President Kennedy went on a media blitz around civil rights, right? Firmly associating his party, the party of the New Deal, with civil rights. And then, of course, we know that his successor, Lyndon Johnson, would, after signing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts into law, become the last Democrat running for president to win the majority of white voters to this day. Now, I say that not for partisan reasons, but just to illustrate how there was a massive ideological shift away from the idea of the public, away from support for many things public, from public schools, where we saw massive drained pool politics, right? We saw massive resistance in Virginia. We actually, many counties closed down their public schools altogether and were willing to educate white students in, basements of homes rather than go to integrated schools. And we began to see the rise of segregation academies, the rise of private schools and parochial schools that could have whiter student bodies in the wake of public school integration. And so the book that some of us really includes, sort of each chapter really talks about a different big puzzle in our society, right? Why we can't have a nice thing, whether it is uh, each public policy issue. Tonight, I just want to briefly touch on two where drain pool politics is so vivid. The first is higher education, right? One of the big head scratchers of American society is, why did college used to be free or virtually free back when it wasn't even important to have a college degree to have a middle class life? And why did we, when the college degree became more important, uh, drain the pool of public resources in public colleges, right? So the vast majority of young people are educated in public colleges. Government used to pick up the tab in terms of state funding. Anything that was left over was paid for by a federal grant, not a loan, right? Any kind of federal grant would have covered $3 out of $4 of the average tuition as late as the 1980s. Of course, now it has plummeted, and so we've switched from grants to loans. We've seen significant cutbacks on state funding, and of course, the result has been a sort of stealth privatization of our public colleges. And when we were making college free, it wasn't charity by the government, it was an investment like a road or a bridge. It was one of the most powerful investments that the government ever made in the United States. Most of our competitors have followed that model, have kept tuition low, have seen it as important for international competitiveness, and we are all, in one way or another, paying the cost for the shift that happened uh, when the face of the average student became not what it was before, right? 90% white college going population, mostly male, but rather more and more young people of color going to college, and more of this anti government sentiment being with oftentimes with very racialized dog whistle politics in state legislatures, where we would see disinvestment from the youth of a society. And in fact, other research shows that the more there is a demographic distance between the older, whiter population and the younger of color population, the more severe the college funding cuts have been. And we've really seen that. And one of the things that really brings this home for drain pool politics is that, of course, just like with a drain pool, this kind of disinvestment has a cost for everyone, right? So many parts of our society are suffering when the youngest, most diverse, most college educated generation in history has this overhang that's stopping them from starting businesses and buying homes, and even starting families. Right? Another area where you see drained pool politics is healthcare, right? Where we stand alone in our industrialized peers in not providing some form of universal health care. We pay more for healthcare as a society and get lower outcomes, and most people are unhappy. Well, racism actually stopped us from ever filling in the pool of public goods around healthcare in the first place. It was in the 1940s that Harry Truman first proposed the idea of national health insurance, but it was the Dixiecrat segregationist caucus of his party that wouldn't allow national health insurance. They thought that equal health care would be a threat to Jim Crow, right? So that was defeated back then. And then even the closest thing that we have to universal coverage, of course, is the Affordable Care Act. But if you look at the opinion data, even though white Americans are the largest share of the uninsured, white Americans, the majority, have been opposed to the very idea of Obamacare since the first black president signed it into law. And we have seen many states refuse to expand Medicaid. And there's research that I go into in the book about the higher share of black population in the state, the less likely a state is to expand Medicaid and all of the racial politics that go with that. But of course, again, with drained pool politics, everyone is paying a cost. People of color are paying the most, right? The little black children who never got to swim in the beautiful public pool. But of course, the entire community loses out, right? Because fundamentally, and this is really the lesson, it's the lesson for young people, our biggest problems we have got to solve together. What is government? Government is people coming together to do together what we can't accomplish alone. And when it comes down to it, the most important things in life, I simply can't do on my own, right? I can read to my son, I can do all of that. I can't make sure that his neighborhood school is an excellent and well funded one on my own. That takes government, right? That takes us coming together. I can recycle all I want. I can't slow down global climate chaos on my own, right? That takes us coming together and doing things collectively that we simply can't do on our own. And so as I began to see how the zero sum racism and the drain pool politics was in so many different areas of our society, democracy, housing, education. There's a chapter in the book called Living Apart where I go through the way that inequitable school funding has been tied to racist policies and how that has costs for everyone. We really begin to see that what the way that racism has a cost for everyone is because it tries to choke off our ability to come together across lines of race and solve collective problems collectively. And so then I began to really think, well, okay, well, if that's the problem, then perhaps coming together across lines of race and seeing the real power of collective action is the solution. And so I began to look for what I called solidarity dividends. And this image here is an illustration that is in the opening, the chapter illustration for the solidarity dividend chapter. And it's sort of a picture of a group of, different folks from different walks of life coming together to turn the spigot together and refill the pool of public goods together. And the solidarity dividend stories that I collect in the book and then that I really focus exclusively on in the podcast of The Sum of Us are all about people coming together across lines of race, taking on a powerful opposition, a powerful interest, trying to address a problem that often has been caused, at least in part, by racism and our politics and our policymaking, coming together, being able to really understand one another, get over conflicts, mistrusts, right? Navigate the tricky lines of race, and in so doing, be able to accomplish together what we simply can't alone. And it's these stories of solidarity dividends that end most of the chapters in the book. This solidarity dividend chapter is the last chapter of the book. And then, as I said, the podcast, each episode is another solidarity dividend story. I'll just quickly reference the first full episode of the podcast, which takes place in Memphis, Tennessee, where I got a chance to meet a young man who, in his mid 20s, early 20s, had become, he was just an assistant at a nonprofit home, working from home in Memphis in order during the pandemic. And he learned about a pipeline that was threatening the historically black community in Memphis, and it was being ignored, right? This oil pipeline that was threatening people's land in black Memphis was being ignored by the powers that be. But it was also slated to go across what is one of the sort of crown jewels of that area of Tennessee, which is a huge natural sand aquifer that gives Memphis, Tennessee, some of the most sweet, some of the sweetest drinking water in the whole country. And so you had these white environmentalist types who were really worked up over the threat of the pipeline the to the clean water. And yet these groups were kind of, on different sides of the tracks in Memphis. Memphis is an extremely segregated city. There are 97% white, 97% black uh, communities in Memphis. But it was this young man who really was able to weave these groups together and to create a cross-racial coalition. The organization was called Memphis Community Against the Pipeline, and they came together. They brought Black Memphis and White Memphis together. And the episode of the podcast called "The Sweetest Water in the World" includes these beautiful stories of these amazing figures from this triumph, and it was a victory. They were able to do what rarely happens, which is they was a local community stopping a multinational, multi-billion-dollar oil pipeline from coming through their community with the safety risks that were there and the environmental injustice and pollution that had always been in Black Memphis. That young man who led that movement is a young man named Justin J. Pearson, and I got to know him a few years ago. He would then, after leading this grassroots multiracial coalition to win the solidarity dividend of clean water in Memphis, would then go on to run for state legislature, and he's one of the so-called Tennessee Three who were silenced and kicked out of their seats for siding with protesters after the terrible mass school shooting at the Covenant School in Tennessee. And then, of course, they won their seats back. And so stories like that of how you come together across lines of race, how you deal with our history in community, and create a better future together are really what I want people to take away from the Sum of Us, from the book, from the podcast. And I'm just the response to the podcast and the book has been really surprising to me in so many ways. Because as you know, some of the questions are already alluding to, and of course we know, it can really feel like whenever you talk about race in our society, people go into their camps. But I'm here to tell you that I spend most of my time on the road going, all across the country talking about these issues. I've brought the young readers version into classrooms in rural areas, suburban areas, urban areas, and there is a hunger for some truth. The vast majority of people in this country believe that we should teach the good parts of our history and the bad parts of our history. The vast majority of the people in this country are opposed to the banning of books. They want to know how we got here. Their conscience was awakened by the summer of 2020 and the murder of George Floyd, and they want to know, most importantly, how we can go forward together. And that's really why it's been so wonderful to see so much resonance for these stories of cross-racial solidarity, saying, you know what, no, we are not all in the same position here, right? There are these massive inequalities, but to make life better for people who are struggling, it does not mean that it has to come at anyone else's expense, right? That most of us will be better off if we all have nice things. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so very, very much. We have a few questions. Actually, the questions came in pretty early, and I'll let everyone know. We have about another 15 minutes remaining. So I'll go through the list, and in the time that we have, we get Heather's responses. But again, we want to be respectful and mindful of everyone's time. But we'll go ahead and jump right in. Carolyn had a question pretty early on, and her question is, how is zero-sum thinking like or unlike replacement theory?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Sorry, keep going. Was that it?
Yeah. That's her question. It was just
no, absolutely. So when the white supremacist who had been very much influenced by, again, powerful, wealthy people, wealthy, self-interested, powerful people selling the zero-sum story for their own profit, right? The paid bullies in the corporate media had been selling these stories of, your America is being threatened by the presence of people of color, uh, you know, um, this great replacement theory. I immediately thought, well, when the attack happened in Buffalo, I immediately thought, well, that is another word for another term for the zero sum, right? That we can't all share in America's bounty, and that there is this idea that there will be a race war because more people of color are trying to replace white people as the predominant, both in numerically and in terms of power, and that therefore, you know, immigration, the very presence of people of color of any way, should be seen as a threat to white people. Right? That's the story that's being sold. But again, and this is really important. I know a lot of times, we want to find a way to reach people who are not predisposed to want to hear about this. And what I want to say, and this was kind of the lesson for me of the moment that I had with the racist caller on C-SPAN who called and admitted his prejudice and bias and said, "I want to be better." As I got to know that person, his name is Gary from North Carolina, I really learned that in so many ways he too is a victim, right? He is someone who had been sold these racist lies through the mass media, through politics, through social media, and ultimately, I want us all to hold accountable the people who are selling these racist ideas for their own profit, right? Whether it's their economic profit or their political profit, right? It's people who are selling these racist ideas, not the folks who are desperate enough to buy them. And so, one of the real promises of this idea of really calling out the zero sum as a lie and trying to awaken young people's critical thinking as to, well, whose interest is it to have us fighting one another, to have working and middle class white people blaming immigrants and their neighbors of color for the loss of good jobs, as opposed to blaming the corporations who are shipping the jobs overseas and the billionaires who are profiteering, right? So those kinds of questions, I hope, can create a sense of, well, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be us versus them in our community. Maybe there really is a small number of people who are benefiting from this inequality, and it just so happens that they often are the same people who really are selling these racist ideas.
Good deal. Thank you so much for that. We have another question. Actually, we received it pretty early on as well. Hold on, lost my spot there. In the current climate of book banning and silencing of teachers and authors, have you experienced any pushback towards your book as it is used in the classroom, whether regionally or in states? Um, but have you received any pushback as a result of your book?
It's interesting. I expected a lot. I expected a lot when it first came out. I expected a lot of pushback. I expected um, I expected a lot more than I've gotten, to be honest. And I was, in some ways, sort of, bring it on when it was
Mhm.
the time to publish the young readers book. I, like most people who love learning and education, are have been devastated by the authoritarian assault on our children's freedom to learn, right? And
Mhm.
the chilling effect that it's having on librarians and educators. It is drained pool politics, right? Because it is a narrow elite trying to um, uh, could frankly scare white parents away from public schools, right? It is trying to create financial penalties for libraries and educators and school districts for teaching the full spectrum of American history and some of our greatest writers. And it is wildly unpopular. Most Americans believe it is un-American, And so I have a lot of um, uh, defiance about all of
Mhm.
this. But at the same time, I also recognize that there are young learners who just want, who may come from conservative households, they may be living in a book banned state, and they want to know how to make sense of it all. And so that's why I do try to offer the educators guides and the resources, and just in general, this idea, the core idea of the sum of us, is that it doesn't have to be a zero sum. It doesn't have to be us versus them. That it is not about American history versus Black history. It is not about teaching the history and the present extent of racism. Should not is not about making white students feel guilty, because what I'm saying is that it's got a cost for them too. And they
Mhm.
should feel that it is in their own interest to have a more equal society.
Mhm. You know, another question we have is about the solidarity dividend, and do you see greater efforts, particularly in a post January 6th America,
Yeah.
greater efforts to overcome or to win the solidarity dividend?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It's been really, as I said, I went back out on the road, right? So my journey to write the book was a 3-year journey, and then published the book in 2021. But of course, they take a long time to print, right? So November was I the editor, wrestled it out of my hands on November, I think it was 8th,
Mhm.
2020, right? So we had just finally gotten the results of the 2020 election. It had been the summer of 2020, but it was not yet January, right? So I ended the book with a lot of hope, but also, not as many stories of solidarity dividends. I had, a handful of them throughout the book, but in fact, if I ended the book thinking, well, I wish I had more time to find more solidarity dividend stories. So then the book comes out, 2 weeks after January 6th happens. Um, there's, oh, there's just, my head is full. It really does feel like people who as Amanda, um, the poet laureate,
Mhm.
Amanda Gorman,
Mhm.
wrote in her poem. We've seen in people who would a force that would rather destroy democracy than share it, and um, this very zero sum idea was very disheartening, but I had the ability to go back out onto the road, and it was amazing. Um, I would say that since the kind of crisis and the wake up call of January 6th, uh, since the understanding by many people across the country that um, there is racial injustice, the sort of high point of the summer of 2020. So many people can get cynical. I mean, they can say, okay, well, it feels like the movement has died. There's nobody rallying or protesting anymore. Everyone's gone back to their normal lives. And yet, what I'm here to tell you, because of all of the time that I spend across the country, um, where you see the changes in the local areas,
Mhm.
these um, the new awareness, the awakening. It's hard to unlearn something you've learned, right? The summer of 2020, you go out and you read, um, Cast or something like that, right? Like you read history, you start seeing things that you had not seen before. You don't unsee those things, right? And so, what I in the solidarity dividend stories in the podcast, almost to a person, people would say to me that when I asked them sort of how they came to be an activist or how they took on this role, often reluctantly, they um, would not have done it if not for the summer of 2020. That something in them shifted. their ability to see themselves as being a part of something bigger, see that this is a movement moment, see that we can't just wait for politicians to do all of the work, but that it is, you know, ordinary people like Fannie Lou Hamer and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King who became extraordinary icons, but they were, I mean, Cesar Chavez, right? These are like sharecroppers, seamstresses, right? Preachers, right? These are ordinary people who became extraordinary leaders, and I think we've been in one of those catalyzing moments for so many movements, uh, whether it's young people on climate, the dreamers, racial justice, unions and labor rights, right? So we're in a moment, and I think that solidarity is the core feature of all of those movements.
Good deal. Thank you so much. We have a question from Jody, and we'll take maybe one other after this if we have time. But Jody, her question is with all these impediments when it comes to amassing wealth for people of color, what do you see as the answer for blacks in this country? More involvement in the political process, entrepreneurship, and
Mm.
I will yeah, I will add that I'm pretty sure that's very difficult, and that's a question that requires a pretty robust answer. But I want to be sure to get to it.
Yeah, no problem. So, well, for the past few cycles, right, African Americans have had quite high voter turnout. So, I mean, I think, you know, black folks are 13% of the population nationally. So we do what we can, but we're not, we are, we are a minority, right? And so I think that what we need to see is a few things. One, we as a country had incredibly generous wealth building policies. And when I'm talking about wealth here, this is very important. It's a big thing that I think is important for students to really understand. We're not talking about a paycheck, right? We're not talking about what the income that comes from your job every 2 weeks. Wealth is what you have, not just what you earn, right? It's your home equity, it's your savings, it's an inheritance, it's stocks and bonds and securities, right? It's the value of your assets, your jewelry, your car, right? Minus the loans, right? It is it is what makes for security. And it is also what kind of makes or breaks economic success, right? Because you can have two families, one that have the same education and the same job, but if one family has one young married couple has $200,000 from their parents for a down payment on a house, and the other one would just have to save $200,000 over years of working, right? That is a very different economic trajectory, right? We are now at a point where in this country you can't buy a starter home unless you have that kind of down payment help from already having wealth in your family, right? And so this story of wealth is really a racial story in the U.S. as well. Black families have less than a dime in wealth for every dollar that white families have on average. A black college graduate has less wealth on average than a white high school dropout. And of course, a white high school dropout does not have the same income as a black college graduate, but the black college graduate can't go back in time and make sure that her grandparents weren't redlined out of home ownership, right? And so, what the answer is about wealth. And I do believe that even if we were to do some things like wealth based reparations, I don't even see those as a zero sum because we have so much potential that is on the sidelines in this country. And we were so generous to a whites only pool of Americans for so long, and it created the American century and it created massive, massive prosperity. And it was only when the pool got integrated that we stopped investing in that way, and we had a different paradigm of economic policy. We had the inequality era, low minimum wage, not enough support for housing, all of the different things. And we need to get back to a place where we're actually investing in our greatest asset, which is our people, but this time do it for all of our people.
All right, perfect, perfect. Everyone, I believe that is our time. Thank you so much, Heather, for sharing your expertise with us tonight, for sharing your journey through the Sum of Us and through stories of hope and solidarity. Everyone, this is our first webinar. We just spent an hour and a half with Heather McGhee, uh, best-selling author, advocate, and speaker. Thank you and bless you. We appreciate you more than you know. Everyone, if I had the sound effects, I would I would play them. But thank you again. We appreciate you. And thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us. A special thanks to Manoj Thanadi, who is in the chat. He was our TA for this evening. He's actually a member of our Teacher Advisory Council. And Manoj, he was dropping resources throughout the chat. What a great way to start off the 23-24 series. It was remarkable. It was fascinating. We truly enjoyed it. And, everyone take this back to your classroom. Follow Heather McGhee on all social media. Please incorporate this into your curriculum. There were a few questions about how to do so. Hopefully, the conversations in the chat, the responses, everything tonight gave you the resources, or provided you with the resources to be able to apply this in your respective instructional environment. So, again, we appreciate you, and please keep up with all things that are going on at the National Humanities Center, at nationalhumanities.org, or one of our various social media networks. I encourage you all to check us out. We will be back Thursday night at 7 o'clock p.m. For digital humanities and digital pedagogy in the K-12 classroom with Kelly Hammond, who's out of the CUNY School of Professional Studies in the Development and Instructional Technology Department. Again, digital humanities and digital pedagogy in the K-12 classroom. Again, I hope you all had a restful and a restorative summer. We are back and we're ready to do it. And I, again, look forward to supporting, surrounding you, and just looking forward to, most of all, learning from you all. Take care and have a great week.